Chapter 7. Alone. For years, our life in Southeast Asia had expanded naturally, almost without question. Work opened new doors, relationships deepened, villages became second nature. Our home stayed full of people, passing through seasons of struggle, growth, and celebration. We were busy, tired, and deeply content. It felt permanent, or at least permanent enough, that we never spoke about an end. Yet beneath the surface, small pressures began gathering. Travel restrictions tightened in some regions. Funding that had once stretched just far enough began thinning. Visas grew harder to secure and renew. None of it happened in one theatrical moment. It arrived in subtle layers, each manageable on its own, but together they began pressing against the life we had built. We adapted the way we always had, working more, teaching English for meager pay, taking on whatever opportunities appeared, trusting that the next solution would come into view as it always had before. For a long time it did, until eventually it didn't. It was no longer viable. We lived between continents in a way that made sense to us, even if it confused others. When we returned to our home countries, it was rarely to settle. We worked intensely during those visits, taking whatever jobs were available while reconnecting with family and regrouping physically and financially. Once we had saved sufficient funds, we went back to Asia to resume the work we felt called to. It was an unconventional cycle, but for years it allowed us to remain where we believed we belonged. We thrived in Southeast Asia, becoming deeply connected to the culture and the land we served. We envisioned staying until our last days, maybe even being laid to rest in some remote rice paddy no one had heard of. TJ, being the man he was, imagined an Asian sky burial, the body cut apart and left high in the mountains for sacred vultures to feed on. They believed the soul departed the body and ascended into the heavens. He would joke, but with all seriousness. For us, the chances of living to a ripe old age overseas seemed slim. Not out of pessimism, but simple reality. High risk and low life expectancy were part of the landscape. If it were not for health, it could be transportation. Stories of buses careening off mountains were not rare. There were countless variables that pulled people from the earth sooner than expected. Unlike many missionaries or humanitarian workers, we had both made a lifelong commitment to Asia as our permanent station. We were like the Vikings of old, burning the ships behind us, so there was no return and no option but to face whatever lay ahead. We never looked back toward the West where we had come from. Perhaps as a way of coping with the dangers and differences of living abroad, we sometimes made light of it. We even romanticized it. The idea of growing old together in some distant place felt almost cinematic, like an old plane lost in the jungle and discovered decades later, its skeleton crew still seated inside, surrounded by rusted tins and bottles untouched by time. But our time in Southeast Asia ended abruptly. We had always known it was possible, yet we held onto hope, perhaps stubbornly, that something would shift and allow us to remain. Support for the work had dwindled, and the system that had sustained us for years was fracturing. The tourism business was no longer sustainable, and the balance we had maintained between earning in the West and living in Asia no longer stretched far enough. Even as we made one last attempt to hold on to the life we had built, the cracks continued to widen. I had spent more than half my life in Asia, more years than in the country where I was born. I had imagined living out my final years there, rooted in a place that had become our dwelling place, only to be pulled away into the unknown. We had two choices, Europe or America. Europe through my passport and heritage, America through TJ's passport and country of origin. Both meant leaving the life we had built behind. We did not want to fall into a routine that felt boxed in by mortgages and predictable schedules. For years, we had lived moving between places because that was what our work and life required. Walking away from that life was extremely difficult. Our short-term plan was to continue to the United Kingdom, where I was born. We did not intend to stay long, only to regain our footing in the West after decades overseas. Eastern Europe was among our potential destinations, but we had made no plans. France lay only 20 miles across the English Channel from Dover, and it became our route back into the United Kingdom for one reason: Jedi. By then, he was an elderly dog who had spent his life crossing borders and continents with us. Flying a dog directly into the UK can mean quarantine for up to 6 months. England is strict, like Australia and other island nations. Jedi, of course, did not know rules or borders. I could not bear the thought of Jedi being locked away. I researched and found a small jurisdictional gap. We flew into Paris. Mainland Europe had fewer restrictions. Jedi's rabies shot cleared him for France. Once in Europe, before Brexit, we could cross borders freely. We flew into Paris and picked up Jedi. He came down the conveyor belt inside an oversized kennel with his blankie pacing in circles, eyes bright with anticipation. We went through customs and immigration and finally reached our dog. We rented a car and drove to Calais. They issued Jedi his own European pet passport in a small office there. It included a paw print, microchip identification, and vaccination records. From Calais, we drove through the Channel Tunnel to Dover and entered the United Kingdom. We presented all 3 passports: mine, my husband TJ's, and our dog's. By then, I had become fluent in visas and border rules. I had also learned how little we needed to live. We even tried van life in a tiny Volkswagen. We crossed Europe that way, sleeping folded into narrow spaces, cooking on a single burner, and measuring our days by where we could park without being moved along. We spent time with my family in England, travelled through Wales, and explored parts of the Scottish Highlands. From there, we took the ferry across the Irish Sea to Ireland. Jedi slept snug in our duvet while we braced ourselves on deck. The Irish Sea is notoriously rough, volatile, and prone to sudden changes, with shallow waters, strong tidal currents, and Atlantic storms. The passage was raw and unrelenting, far rougher than I had imagined. We were chasing the simplicity we had known in Asia, but no matter how we adjusted, limits kept appearing. Every path eventually closed. Europe never quite opened the door the way we had hoped it might, and slowly we realized the life we wanted would require crossing one more ocean. Finally, after weighing it all, we decided on America. With everything we owned in 6 duffel bags, about $800 in the bank, and Jedi, we reached our final destination. We were apprehensive, carrying the weight of our past lives, alongside the fragile hope of what awaited. We stayed with TJ's father, grateful for the roof over our heads and the temporary place to land. Leaving life overseas behind was heartbreaking. The streets, the smells, the faces, the sounds of Asia lingered in our memories, whispering what we had lost even as we stepped into the Western way of living. We lived unsettled lives during our first 2 years in America. We packed, moved, unpacked, and packed again across multiple states. Eventually, in Montana, our lives found a measure of normalcy. TJ found work as a Finnish carpenter, rounding out his income with tree trimming on the side and the occasional odd job with skills he'd first honed years earlier for the power utility company. I had just completed the grueling process of becoming a lawful, permanent resident, filled with paperwork, fees, and appointments, and I could finally contribute. For 2 years, we had lived on one income, and now we had two. Life did not give us time to rest. DJ's father and brother were involved in a violent car crash. His father went to the hospital by airlift, survived the ICU, transferred into rehabilitation, and then passed away a month later. His brother sustained severe injuries, and doctors stabilized him before sending him home because of insurance limitations. I took TJ's brother to Thailand, where we could afford surgery to reattach his arm to his shoulder. What was financially impossible in America became possible because of my experience, knowledge, and connections in Asia. On top of everything else, our Asian mountain dog let us know it was time to say goodbye. 14 years old, nearly 100 in dog years, he had traveled the world with us, crossing Asia, Europe, and finally America. After 2 surgeries and battles with cancer, our warrior companion passed away. Losing Jedi hollowed the house in a way only a dog can. The silence afterward was deafening. The house felt too empty. Despite the upheaval, Montana gave us one glorious summer. We spent it on trails, in lakes, and among the mountains, hiking, camping, and backpacking, even through the Great Bear Wilderness. We wore bells fastened to our clothes and carried only a single can of bear spray between us. Each night, we strung our food high in the trees, hoping to keep curious bears away while we slept in a tent not far off, naively believing we had protection. We took full advantage of the weather and every moment between our work schedules. Even as an independent and adventurous woman, I wanted to be a nurturer. I wanted our home to be a place of rest and peace for my husband. TJ would often come home from work, and even if I had worked just as many hours, I made sure there was food on the table. We sat together, talked about our days, and reconnected. I preferred being home to being out with any friends. Our apartment became our sanctuary. By September, we were already counting the weeks before winter sealed the land in snow. October arrived. Like every morning, TJ left first, crossing the street to the storage unit where he kept his tools in and saws. He loaded his 1993 bright blue Ford F-150, a truck he adored, a rare find with only 40,000 miles and chrome that still shined like new. I followed behind in my 4-wheel drive 1993 F-150, honked and waved, and he waved back. It was an ordinary morning. That was the last time I ever saw him. Mid-morning at work, I received a phone call telling me my husband, TJ, had been in a car accident and that I needed to get to the hospital immediately. The sinking feeling hit my stomach without warning. Questions flooded my mind as I tried to calculate the best case and worst case scenarios. It was terrifying. A couple of women I worked with drove me to the hospital. They were kind people, though I only knew them through work. None of us knew what to make of the situation. All we knew was that it was urgent. When I arrived, it was the height of the COVID pandemic. I immediately found myself separated from everything and everyone. I was alone. Hospital policy prohibited additional visitors. The sterile environment felt cold and unnerving. I was required to put on a mask, and with all the protocols in place, I felt isolated before I even reached the emergency department. Someone escorted me into a room to wait and assigned me a strange, interfaith clergy person. I remained there for nearly an hour, questioned about my faith and other things I barely remember. The worst small talk I had ever experienced. I should have known something was terribly wrong. It would have been best and preferred to be left alone. The entire experience felt unsettling and unnecessary. Eventually, the doctor came in. My ears registered the words, but my heart and mind rejected them at first. I was already in denial without realizing it. I am a realistic person, and within seconds, denial gave way to clarity. TJ was gone. There was nothing more to interpret. He had left this earth. He was dead. There was no room for false hope or alternative outcomes. He was gone, no longer present in any form. They took me to see TJ in a still room, sectioned off in the ER. The accident had been violent, and his body told that story. But the worst of it was softened by a white sheet. His body lay there, but I did not need it to say farewell. TJ had already left. That body, that shell, was not my husband. The essence that made him who he was, the mind, the will, the emotions, his whole soul and spirit, were all gone. I needed to see him only for closure, for the certainty that he was no longer here. This may sound blunt, but it is how I understand life. I said goodbye. There was nothing anyone could do to change what had happened. Nothing could bring him back. There is always that silence in the middle of screaming, that slow motion, while the outside world is still running. When unavoidable chaos hits a situation, we can do nothing because it is unavoidable. You cannot worry and change things that are out of your control, but you can accept that and stay out of the confusion of chaos. By focusing only on what you can do or change, you can keep a somewhat clear head. There is an unnatural peace that allows you to resign from everything that is unimportant at that moment. I had some tears, but I held it together. It was shock, but really I just needed to be alone, away from everyone and everything. This is where I am very different from most people, and I think this is where some of my strength comes from. It would not have mattered who was with me, and it would not have mattered even if I had family close by. I needed to be alone. I had to process this battle and this war zone myself if I was ever going to survive it. People around me were concerned. They told me it was not healthy to be alone in an apartment after losing so much at once. I had lost my whole family. I had lost my dog in May, and now my husband that October. They tried to protect me from isolation and believed presence was the answer. But in all honesty, I needed to be alone. It was the only way to begin the processing the freight train that had come out of nowhere, blindsided me, and run me over. My husband died in a car crash. He died in the ER. I said goodbye to his body. Someone drove me home, though I do not remember who. I remember being walked back into the apartment, people hovering and helping her door with things that no longer mattered. Eventually, after I'd asked to be alone, reluctant and unsure of what else to do, they left, and I closed the door behind them. When that door finally clicked shut, I broke. I dropped to my knees against the door and sobbed uncontrollably, experiencing a shattering and grief so deep and strange. I remember taking a shower, a place to retreat. The shower was still running, steam filling the room, hot water pouring over my back as if it could wash away something that had no name. Until then, I had been making sure everyone else was okay and taken care of. That was when the questions came, all at once. How could this happen? How did this happen? It was so fast, so random. 1 minute we were talking about leftovers for Thursday, maybe going out Friday if we felt like it. Normal life. And then suddenly I was alone in that apartment without my family. I had lost everyone overnight. The sound that came out of me did not feel human. It came from somewhere deep and primitive, pulled from a void inside my soul. I wept until my body heaved, buckled on the floor with my forehead pressed against tile, water mixing with tears and mucus, unable to tell where one ended and the other began. I stayed there long after my legs went numb, long after the water turned lukewarm, because standing up meant stepping into a world where he no longer existed beside me. The silence was unbearable. No husband, no dog, not loneliness. Loneliness suggests something could fill the space. This was the removal of presence itself. In the middle of the confusion, there was also a strange black and white clarity. Right then and there, I could have laid down and died. I do not mean to take my life. I mean, let life take me. Let everything that had already tried to break me finally finish the job. The bed felt unnaturally large and cold. Not just empty, but absent of the warmth that had once existed without thought. I noticed how human presence occupies space through breath, movement, heat, and the simple knowledge that another living soul is nearby. That awareness did not fade. It sharpened. If someone has ever walked into a room and felt another presence they could not see, this was the opposite of that sensation. Every instinct that expects another person to exist beside you suddenly has nowhere to land. There were bottles of whiskey TJ had collected from Scotland and Ireland, expensive ones we saved for special occasions. I had zero desire to dull the pain. I also had access to medication that could have forced sleep. Neither option tempted me. I understood with absolute certainty that numbing grief does not remove it, it only delays it, and when it returns, it comes heavier. I believed time might eventually soften the edges, but only if I walked through the grief. Food became irrelevant. It was not forgetfulness or punishment. My body simply rejected the idea of eating as unnecessary. Days passed where I had to remind myself to drink water, not out of health discipline, but because some distant logical part of me understood survival still required it. Hunger did not exist. It was as though the systems that reminded my body to live had gone along with everything else. I couldn't sleep. The bed, once a place of shared warmth, now felt hollow, like a body without its spirit. I had crashed into sleep to cope, only to wake up and find that nothing had changed. The first morning I woke up without TJ, there was no flood of memories or panic. There was only a deep, black hollow where presence used to exist. Not sadness at first, not even thoughts, just an awareness that something essential had left the air. My body noticed before my mind did. The bed felt unnaturally still. The room felt stripped of a muted energy I had lived beside for years. It was not the absence of noise, it was the absence of life shared in the same space. Time itself lost meaning. Days passed because clocks insisted they did, but internally nothing advanced. Conversations, responsibilities, routines, all of it felt distant and strangely weightless, as if life had shifted into something I watched rather than lived. I had been dying slowly for a long time already, being pulled out of Southeast Asia. I think everyone gets moments like this. I have had more than one. Moments where something inside you splits clean down the middle and you realize you only get two choices. You can either lie down and die, or you can stand your ground. And I refused to disappear. Slowly, if that was what it took, I knew I would get myself up off the floor. My feet would be next, after finding my way back to my knees. I did not run or fight. I just stayed where I was, heels dug in, breathing through it. I asked the questions, of course. Why did this happen? Why was it allowed to happen? But underneath all of that, the truth was simpler. I did not want this to be my life, or want it to be the ending. Around, spinning inside, taking one small step at a time so I would not freeze in place. There were moments when I wanted to give up, moments when I wanted to stop, to scream, to disappear somewhere better, somewhere with no tears and no goodbyes. But that is not how it works. Not yet. Grace itself must declare that it is finished. Until then, when life knocks you down cold, you lie still until you find the strength to rise to your knees. You may stay there for a while, just holding the ground beneath you. And when there is a little more strength, you rise to your feet. And even when there is not enough to take one step forward, you stand. Sometimes I felt like my heart was being flayed open, completely exposed, with no wall left to protect me, because my protection was gone. No husband, no shield, losing everything I loved about married life, including having a man beside me, suddenly stripped away the security I had. And that was terrifying. I had lived single into my 30s, but I loved being married, sharing a life, and not being alone in it. Suddenly, half of me was missing, and there was no map for how to walk that kind of ground. Yes, I lost the love of my life, but it was deeper than that. I lost half of myself. I was already on a trajectory, and I knew I had to stay the course. I continued in the life that had already begun. There was no turning back.